What is the best compact SUV? Well, to find out, we gathered 7 models for the 2019 Compact SUV Challenge. Included in days of testing were top trim levels of the Honda CR-V, the Hyundai Tucson, the Jeep Cherokee, the Nissan Rogue, the redesigned Subaru Forester, the redesigned Toyota RAV4, and the Volkswagen Tiguan. We've been doing these multi-vehicle tests for more than a decade, and sometimes we find things we really don't like. And you know, consumers sometimes buy hundreds of thousands of them anyway, or even millions of them. Well, this time around, we the judges agree that everything in this test is actually quite good. The differences aren't nearly what they used to be. So, be sure to pay real close attention to what we found that distinguishes them from each other and decide what matters most to you. So why don't we start with the model that came in last, the Nissan Rogue, which was in 7th place. It is one of the oldest in the test, and that doesn't necessarily doom a model to failure, but in the case of the Rogue, it didn't do as well as it could have, despite being one of our award winners in previous years.
Yeah, it's not aging as well as some of the other ones in our test, and that really stood out to me in the inside. I mean, we had the highest trim levels of these ones, but you see it in the Rogue, it's not consistent.
The Rogue didn't look it.
It didn't look it, right. There's some really nice stuff next to really basic materials, and also in some of the technology too. It had a really small screen, and just
the look of it, the graphics.
Right. It's
I
just
saw that 5 years ago.
Right. It's
nice.
behind the times.
There were things that I also noticed that maybe features that weren't real important several years ago, like having driving modes like Sport and Eco. They have them, but they're kind of down not just out of sight, but out of reach by your left knee, so you can't even tell by feeling where they are. Stuff like that has been better integrated in the other vehicles in the test because they put it right where they know you're going to use it and see it. But then there's the flip side to it, which is it has ProPilot Assist, which is a really well done, like, driver aid umbrella, package of features like adaptive cruise control and lane centering. So it's a weird mix of noticeably aged and pretty modern stuff. And then drivability was definitely something.
Fix the CVT. Yeah. I mean, talk about things that aren't aging well. They were one of the first with them.
Right.
They've gotten much better.
Right.
In the Rogue, you step on the gas, it's like you stepped on the cat's tail. I mean, it just roars.
Well, we should move on to number 6 in the test, the Jeep Cherokee. What stood out to you guys about the Cherokee?
One thing for me, this was the only model in our tests with a V6 engine. All the others had the 4 cylinders of various turbos and non-turbos, and I thought the V6 hid a lot of the ills of the 9-speed automatic that we've noticed over the years, but not all of them. At least for me, I noticed it has a really, I found annoying tendency to kind of short shift right when you're starting off, and also occasional clunking when you're just cruising along. That 9-speed refinement's improved quite a bit over the years, but it's still not where it needs to be. I mean, when you look at these other good...
Is much better, but
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I mean, people will look at it and say V6, oh, that's got to be better. Not necessarily. Nowadays, with direct injection and turbocharging, a smaller displacement engine can be just as powerful. But having said that, I will mention that the output on that thing is quite high, and even though the Cherokee is one of the heaviest, possibly the heaviest model in the test, it still has a lot of power. I really felt like it was robust, definitely one of the strongest points about it. And interior quality is another area where I thought maybe it was partly because of the light colored upholstery, which I always find more rich. I thought it had a really nice interior, nice execution.
Yeah, it's definitely held up better than the Rogue in that regard. Yeah. Talking about kind of vehicles from similar eras, and I think they do a really good job on the multimedia front still.
Oh, absolutely.
Though, I mean, the Uconnect system, the speed, the ease of use is really great. I still don't like how they hide like seat heaters and steering wheel heaters in the screen. I do
buttons that disappear.
Yeah.
But even in that case, it's all on the same screen.
Exactly.
I can control all the heaters, the steering wheel, everything. All from
right. They make good use of that touchscreen in ways that others don't. Subaru will get to in a moment. Number 5 in the count up was a newcomer, the Toyota RAV4. I think we have to say first off, that the Toyota RAV4 is way more competitive in its redesigned form in this test than the previous generation had been for a long time. I mean, frankly, it was the stinker in these comparison tests for years and years, and it is much stronger. And that we have to emphasize that things are so tight now and the differences are so small that even the RAV4 placing lower in the class was really good.
I wanted to like it better. I like how it looks, number one. We didn't score that, but it is a bit bigger. But when I got inside, not as much bigger as it looked. The back seat is really not very accommodating. The cushion's low. If you're my height, you sit, which is 6'2", you sit with your knees up on a low cushion, and the whole thing feels narrower. The front seats feel closed in.
One of the areas where the RAV4 has improved is drivability. Not best in class, but improved. I was a little disappointed in the drivetrain. I thought early on that it was a continuously variable transmission because it had this droning sound to it. You would accelerate and then let up and it would just keep that drone sound going. And then later we found out it's an 8-speed conventional automatic transmission, which is mind-boggling to me because it had some of the characteristics of a CVT, including one important one, which is it's really efficient. I mean, in our mileage test, the RAV4 came in first, which is impressive. The other reason that I wasn't as wild about it is the all-wheel drive system seemed to be the most reactive. Like, I had the front wheels spinning, like losing traction before the rears would kick in, and it was the only vehicle like that in the whole test. And it just didn't have the refinement I had expected.
I like what they've done with the design there and like the layout. I like where that screen's positioned. It's up high. So I thought it was pretty easy to use. It doesn't have Android Auto. That was the only one in this test, I think, that was missing it. But in terms of the layout, the materials, it wasn't quite where my view Tiguan was, but it was pretty well done.
The RAV4 also has more cabin storage than the old one did. I always liked the sort of under-dash shelf that the Highlander had, and they've sort of done a version of that above the glove box.
I thought so too. I think it's pretty well laid out. They did a nice job of integrating stuff where it should be. They did a nice job on the new and larger display in the instrument panel. Pretty easy to get through using controls on the steering wheel. Was pretty impressed overall with the semi-autonomous features.
I think that's worth noting on this one is that you don't have to get the high-end, most expensive one that we had. Safety Sense package is now standard on all of the RAV4.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most complete packages in terms of features.
All right, let's move up in the count up to number 4, the Honda CR-V. It didn't do as well as some people might have thought, but it did have some very clear, repeatable flaws that we all kind of seem to zero in on. I will just mention what my main one was for driving. Despite having enough power, it has a turbocharged 1.5 liter, I think, 4-cylinder in the one we had. Most of the time you're driving, it's fine, but that first couple of seconds of acceleration off the line, even if you floor it, is extremely slow. And if you own this, you really have to get used to that and know that you're not going to be the guy that's diving into traffic from a standstill, because it can be dangerous. It's consistent, so it's not like it surprises you, but that was one of the things that I really, counted it down for.
Yeah, it was noticeable to me. I wondered, because that's the same size engine they put in the Civic.
Right.
So seems like there's room to do something a little bit larger here for people who might want it, but they don't have that right now in terms of like the high power engine.
I thought the handling was quite good in the CR-V. I don't know how you guys graded it, but I really liked the steering, and I thought
Steering was good.
It was like possibly the one vehicle out of this whole group that, as opposed to just feeling competent like the Tiguan, felt a little sporty.
Yeah, it felt a little more agile to me than some of the others. I did get more body lean than in some of them. And the other thing that I noticed, in addition to being a little bumpy, when I got on a rough road, I was getting a little more noise than I expected to get in the CR-V. And the CR-V owned this category for a long time.
It did.
And everybody's catching up. As we've said, they're all very close here. I think most of us downgraded in it are things that we've known for a while and they haven't fixed as they've refreshed the vehicle. One of them is the multimedia system. It still has way too many menus, and you have these little buttons that are way too small for my fingers that are just part of the touchscreen. There's no physical buttons. And they finally added a volume knob, but that's like a Band-Aid on what needed an overhaul. It hasn't gotten it yet.
One area though I thought in terms of the other cabin things where it did separate itself from the others was in-cabin storage. Most of them have kind of the traditional kind of small console box, but Honda has a really nice console bin that's sizable. We found that you can configure it different ways. It was noticeable, especially in a field where they just weren't giving you a lot of storage overall. I mean, there were some nooks in some of them here, but most had these tiny little consoles under the armrests that were just seemed like they hadn't touched it in years. But even these are brand new vehicles.
One thing I liked in the interior is it seemed very serviceable, it seemed very sturdy, and yet it was very nicely designed, and not in a flashy way. Nothing was overdone, but the materials were all really nice, and it had kind of a zen, nice feel to it. It's the best for family hauling. In addition to the cabin storage for your stuff, your gear, your devices, it also has the most cargo room, both in the rated cargo room and in the testing we did, which involves fixed size boxes, and we fill them up to the height of the rear seat.
Shall we move on to the podium? What might be a surprise, the third place finisher overall was the Hyundai Tucson. It is, we should mention right off the bat, the smallest model in the class, and some of its shortcomings are because of that. As we said earlier with the Toyota RAV4, I want to mention the current one, the 2019, versus what might have been available in the past. I was thrilled to see that Hyundai discontinued the 1.6-liter turbocharged engine with the 7-speed dual-clutch automatic transmission, because it was a bulky pairing. So you get a conventional 6-speed automatic transmission, which there's no question has lower mileage, so there's a bit of a trade-off, but the drivability is much better, and I just found that it drove very well, despite the fact that it is very modestly powered.
It's very modestly powered, and the power that you do have, which is similar to the old turbo, comes higher in the RPM range, so you feel it in traffic off the line.
I was also impressed with how it rides. I mean, it rides pretty comfortably. Despite being so small, it didn't feel super sporty, but it was fine. The steering, I thought, was pretty good, because that has been a weakness of Hyundai over in the past.
So has ride, and it's better at both of them.
Yeah, they've improved on both of those things.
I thought on the interior aspect of it, it doesn't have the nicest switches and controls, but it's really thoughtfully laid out. Like another vehicle where everything was where you'd expect to find it. We talked about in the RAV4 the elevated screen, then this also has kind of that
up
higher
with real buttons flanking.
Right, just like easy to use multimedia system, kind of the controls right below it for everything from seat heaters to heated steering wheel to all the other climate stuff. The instrument panel was basic, but it gave you what you needed to know. So I thought a well done layout for all the controls in it.
And for the first time this year, it added a 360 camera as well. In the wider media screen, you could split the backup camera and a 360 view. Again, a very nice thing if you live in a city.
And a lot of those driving aids, the adaptive cruise and the lane centering and such, pretty well executed. And it's making that available pretty much almost across the line, where used to not have half of these features to begin with.
I thought, like the RAV4 too, though, the back seat to me felt low, sitting kind of low, giving you better headroom, but kind of compromising on the seating position a little bit compared to some of the others.
And it is where the slightly smaller footprint shows up.
We should point out one of the areas that the Tucson did well in was value, and that is not uncommon for Hyundai. Now, value for us doesn't mean it costs less. It means what you get for what you pay for. Even though this was the least expensive, as equipped, it had a lot of features anyway, like the generous warranty and a lot of other features that you might have to pay extra for in other vehicles. Let's move up to number 2 in the test, a newcomer, though you might not be able to tell from the outside, the redesigned Subaru Forester 2019. It looks a lot like the old one, but it is a new platform, so it is all new. It turned out quite well in the overall scoring in our test, came in second. As usual, we can't talk about a Subaru without talking about outward visibility. All of these cars, again, pretty good. I can't say any one of them was really hard to see out of, but Subaru, and in the Forester in particular, they take it a step farther by having a low belt line. And that also means the hood's lower, so you can see better when you're parking, you can see behind you, you see more stuff below.
They just go beyond with that really thin roof pillars. Like that was what was noticeable to me, how you just have so much glass around you.
The amount of leather and wraps and stitching is fancier than anything I've seen in a Forester before. It's really just this side of gaudy, and I never thought I'd say that about a Subaru. They really upped their game in it. Unfortunately, where it fell down a little in the execution is it left you with lots of switches and controls moved to lots of different places, so you had to kind of figure out where.
Absolutely. I was disappointed in that largely, and not to say that that doesn't exist in other vehicles, but because it was a redesign and it has this relatively new touchscreen, I view that as an opportunity for the automaker to have more holistic design. Now you have the instrument panel display, a touchscreen, an additional display above that, and all of them have some, you configure them using buttons on the steering wheel, the two that aren't the touchscreen. And then you have buttons by your left knee and above you, and it's just like they said, all right, where are we gonna put all these things? And they said, we'll put some here, we'll put some here, we'll put some there. And the instrument panel is very cluttered. You really gotta learn it to know where everything is. So I'm not sure they're quite there yet in that regard.
You do get used to it.
Yeah.
So if it were your car, it's not something that would drive you crazy forever, probably, unless it was just the
It
look.
depends on how far along you were when you started.
Just the look.
It might be enough for me.
And it also depends on what you like. I personally like the second little screen up there.
Yeah, I don't mind it either. I just think it's weird that that it's not just a display, that it's another thing that you're controlling using buttons here.
But I had so much fun controlling it, because I can dial around, I can see what the weather is, and it tells me where I am. It's the weather right here. The approach angle or descent angle, if I'm using the hill descent.
I'm getting a feeling he has a much more interesting life than I do.
But it does, I always have the time and temperature available. The compass is in there.
Isn't that what your phone is for?
The graphics are really sharp and a little eccentric, but well done there.
There's a feature called driver focus, which is an attention monitor, driver like alertness monitor, which is not the first time we've seen it there on other vehicles, but in this case they use an actual camera that's looking at your eyes. There's also a feature where it can recognize you, facial recognition, which I did not do because no. But this thing will watch your eyes, and if you're not looking, and unfortunately I was driving the Forester when we went by a wind farm, and all these wind turbines were there, and I'm fascinated by them. I never get to see them, and I'm driving the Subaru, and I'm trying to look at these things, and it keeps beeping at me and flashing.
Pay attention.
And I'm
Watch the road, you fool.
There was no one around. It was perfectly safe, so I found the solution. I put my sunglasses on it.
Joe 1, Subaru 0. Speaking of the drivetrain and the driving experience, something that stood out to me is that it felt like it has a really low center of gravity, like more than the other ones. Even though none of these are really extremely high riding vehicles, this one, and even though it does have that tall roof, everything is low, and that helped it in corners and kind of the handling aspect, I thought.
Even though the ground clearance is 8.7 inches,
Yeah,
so
even though
we know you're up there.
it feels like you're lower, and I like that about this one.
Tell me if you think this is the wrong characterization. I'm not going to say that the Forester doesn't do anything right. It does several things very well, and we've talked about some of them. But one of its real strengths is it doesn't do anything really badly. Pretty balanced overall.
Yeah, I think that definitely came through when I was looking at the categories. Like, it didn't have that one for me where it just was really the worst in the test.
In terms of the practicality of it, the cargo room was very capacious. So in terms of what you need to haul, and particularly Subaru likes to make the point that people with adventurous lifestyles would buy this, so you'd be putting that kind of gear in the back. Whatever it is, whether you're antiquing and putting a chair there, it's easier to get everything in.
I'm pretty sure Subaru already has the active lifestyle and antiquing market cornered.
Both covered. And your dogs will fit there. So
I was gonna say the third was the dogs. Yes, they got the dogs as well. So that brings us to number one. I'm really glad to see and also report that our number one model in this test is a returning winner from the previous test, even though we are different judges than last time. Number one in this case is the Volkswagen Tiguan, which was redesigned just a couple of years ago, and it has a lot going for it. It also happened to be the most expensive vehicle in the test, I believe, like several $1,000s more than some, but we do take that into account, and that is not the reason that it climbed to the top. What were some of the reasons?
Well, drivability for me. If you need an SUV but you would really rather have a Golf GTI, this is the one to get. It's obviously not that good, but it's closer than anything else you'll get in this group.
One of the complaints I think people had about the redesign of the Tiguan the version we're in now, is that when it got bigger, it lost some of that sportiness of the smaller one. And I agree that it's not as sporty as the smaller one. But to me, it's just about how competent it feels. And weirdly, this had 20-inch wheels, which because it's the R line version.
Save your money and don't get them.
Aside from the fact that they're expensive to repair and replace, it actually made it ride more firmly than it would have, but it still rode well. I mean, this was a vehicle that to me just felt richer. And again, it's about how poised it is, how well it handles. To me, less about sportiness, more about just effortlessness, good steering feel, and I like the drivetrain as well.
I mean, $40,000 is a lot to think about if you're looking at this class, but this one, I felt like it justified it in a lot of ways, not just from the driving side, but also when you get into the inside. Like, it had that premium feel. Like, you look at the all-digital instrument panel, that could have been in an Audi.
Right, that's where it comes from. Instead of 2 gauges and a growing display in the middle, it's all display, configurable.
And it looks like it's out of a luxury vehicle. I like the materials consistency throughout the cabin. It's understated, but it's well done. And then when you talk about like the space and roominess you get to in like the second row, it's a really complete package of a small SUV.
And one thing that this vehicle rose to the top in spite of, not because of, is the fact that it had a third row. We didn't ask for a third row seat, but it's an option, and it appeared, and it actually decreases the cargo volume.
Decreases the cargo space, and it also gives you a little bit odder cargo floor.
Yeah, it's raised
and goes uphill a little bit. Why, I don't know. I don't see the point of it's a tiny cramped third row. Small children maybe, but are you going to put small kids back there? I don't know.
Right.
I'm not sure who wants it, and I wouldn't waste my money on it.
Yeah, I wouldn't either.
It's a really nice, roomy front seat, back seat SUV. The third row is a pretend third row. And if you need a third row, Volkswagen has an Atlas.
One of the things that stood out to me in this was really large door pockets in the front, and I was thinking, oh, look, this is great. I'm just, because these cars are so similar and we're looking for things that differentiate them, I was all excited, and then I turned to the center storage console. It was the smallest one in the test. So these vehicles all seem to find ways to like kind of end up back, when you consider everything, end up going back to the center in a way that they're all comparable in some way, which...
That also makes a good point about you getting in the vehicle and figuring out how you would use it and what kind of stuff you take.
I think sometimes when we have these discussions, a consumer might be watching and thinking, well, that's pretty esoteric. I mean, is that really what's most important? Oddly enough, for people who've been doing this work as long as we have, we've kind of come around to the idea that esoteric stuff is often what matters these days, because all these vehicles are so good. I mean, we've had some stinkers in our comparison tests, and there were probably still a couple stinkers on the market, but they weren't in this test. And it can come down to something like, whether it has Android Auto or not, like the RAV4 does not, or something that might be completely irrelevant to one person might matter to you. So it's even more important for people to dig in and look at all the minutia here and find what works most for them.
Right, all of the feature sets are not exactly the same, and different people have different deal breakers. For some people it might be heated back seat. You only have 2 or 3 choices here, out of this group anyway that we have. For other people, there are things that you just never want to see on the car.
Right.
Or it would be, you couldn't live with, and it would bother you for the next 3 years. Every time you got in, you saw it, it would drive you crazy. So.
And I think it's also the use cases we were talking about, like certain ones are going to line up better for someone in this type of lifestyle, like your life stage versus this one. And
life stages, just your geography, the type of neighborhood you're in.
Yeah, what your parking situation is, how many people you have in your family, and how big they are. And part of our testing is the car seat checks for that reason, so you can determine, how easy it is to install child safety seat and such. So it really depends on the individual, maybe more than ever, to dig in and find out what works for them.